My husband told his mother every intimate detail of our marriage problems at Thanksgiving dinner. The turkey wasn't even carved yet when my mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said, "So, I hear you're frigid in bed." The entire table went silent. 23 family members, including my parents, stopped mid-conversation. Dad had been reaching for the cranberry sauce. His hand froze in midair like he was a statue in some twisted Norman Rockwell painting. I stared at my husband across the table. His face had gone sheet white, but he wasn't denying anything. He was just staring at his plate like a coward, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on grandmother's china. "Excuse me?" I managed to whisper. Mother-in-law smiled that cold smile she reserved for special occasions when she wanted to draw blood. "Well, according to my son, you refuse to be intimate more than once a month. And when you do, you just lie there like a dead fish," my mother gasped audibly. His sister immediately started recording with her phone, holding it up like she was documenting some reality TV drama. The teenagers at the kids' table were snickering and whispering among themselves. "That's not," I started, but she cut me off with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "And apparently you've gained 30 pounds since the wedding. He says you've completely let yourself go. No wonder he's been so stressed at work lately." My hands started shaking uncontrollably. I looked around the table at faces I'd known for 3 years, people who had welcomed me into this family with smiles and hugs. Some looked genuinely embarrassed for me. Others seemed entertained by the unfolding drama like they were watching their favorite soap opera. His uncle was actually nodding in agreement while chewing his dinner roll. "Tell them about the therapy," mother-in-law continued, buttering her roll like she was discussing the weather forecast. "How you refuse to work on yourself, how you blame everything on his drinking instead of taking responsibility for your own issues." That's when something inside me snapped completely. "What drinking?" I asked loudly enough that everyone could hear me clearly. The smirk faltered on her face for just a moment. "Did he tell you about the empty bottles I find hidden in his toolbox? The ones stuffed in the garage ceiling tiles? Or how about the flask in his glove compartment that he thinks I don't know about?" Dad slowly put down his fork and looked directly at my husband. My husband's face was turning red, but not from embarrassment, from anger. "Did he mention that I found out about his gambling debts last month? The $23,000 he lost on sports betting? Money that was supposed to go to our mortgage payment?" His brother's wife looked genuinely shocked, her mouth falling open mid-chew. Mother-in-law's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Or maybe he shared how I've been working 60-hour weeks to cover his losses while he tells everyone I'm lazy and unmotivated. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Let me tell you what he didn't share with his loving mother." The room was so quiet you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. How he comes home drunk 3 nights a week and passes out on the couch with the TV blaring. How he hasn't touched me in 4 months. Not the other way around. How he called me a fat cow last Tuesday because I asked him to help with the dishes after I worked a 12-hour shift. Someone's baby was crying in the next room, but nobody moved to check on it. And the therapy? I've been begging him to go for over a year. He went exactly twice, then quit because the counselor had the audacity to suggest he might have a drinking problem. I pulled off my wedding ring and placed it deliberately next to the gravy boat, the small clink of metal against ceramic echoing in the silence. "You want intimate details about our marriage? Here's one for you. Your son is so drunk most nights that he can't even get it up. But sure, let's blame the frigid wife." Mother-in-law's face had gone purple. Several people were staring at their plates. My husband finally looked up from his dinner. "Honey, please don't do this here." I held up my hand to stop him. "Don't you dare honey me after humiliating me in front of both our families, after sharing our private business with your mother so she could use it as ammunition against me." I grabbed my purse and keys from the side table where I'd left them when we arrived. "Enjoy your turkey. I'll be back for my things on Monday while you're at work." As I walked toward the front door, I heard his uncle mutter under his breath, "Well, damn, that was 3 years ago." And it was the beginning of the end of the worst period of my life. The marriage had been deteriorating for months before that Thanksgiving disaster, but I'd been trying so desperately to make it work that I'd lost sight of how toxic everything had become. Looking back now with the clarity that time and therapy provide, I can see the warning signs I'd been ignoring, the red flags I'd convinced myself were just temporary problems that would resolve once he got his act together, and we found our rhythm as a married couple. We'd met at a company mixer 4 years earlier during one of those awkward networking events that nobody really wants to attend, but everyone feels obligated to show up for. He worked in sales for a medical equipment company, and I was in accounting at a firm that handled their books. The connection seemed natural and professional initially. He was charming in that confident salesperson way, funny without being obnoxious, and seemed genuinely interested in my career goals and personal interests rather than just trying to impress me with stories about his own achievements. Our early dating period was everything I'd hoped for in a relationship. Consistent communication, thoughtful gestures, mutual respect for each other's time and independence. He remembered small details about conversations we'd had weeks earlier, brought me coffee prepared exactly the way I liked it, without having to ask, and made genuine efforts to get along with my friends and family members, even when their personalities clashed with his own preferences. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, presenting a ring he'd chosen based on careful attention to my jewelry preferences rather than his own ideas about what was impressive, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. Everything about our relationship seemed healthy, sustainable, and built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine compatibility. The wedding planning process revealed some concerning patterns that I now recognize as early warning signs, but at the time I attributed them to normal stress and the inherent challenges of organizing a major event while managing work responsibilities and family expectations. He'd get disproportionately angry when vendors didn't respond to emails within what he considered a reasonable time frame, or when decisions didn't go exactly as he'd envisioned them in his mental picture of our perfect wedding day. He'd snap at me over relatively small details like invitation wording or flower arrangements, then apologize hours later and blame his reactions on work pressure or family stress. His mother was heavily involved in every aspect of the planning process, often overruling my preferences and treating me like an inconvenience rather than the bride whose wedding we were supposedly planning together. When I mentioned this dynamic to my husband, hoping for support in establishing appropriate boundaries with his family, he'd minimize my concerns and suggest that I should be grateful for her help and experience, rather than complaining about her enthusiasm. The pattern of dismissing my concerns while expecting me to accommodate his family's preferences became established during our engagement, but I convinced myself it was temporary wedding stress rather than a preview of how our marriage would function. The drinking started gradually after we got married, so subtly that I didn't initially recognize it as problematic behavior. A beer after work became 2 beers, then 3. Weekend social drinking extended into weekday evenings. What had begun as normal social drinking at parties and family gatherings evolved into private drinking, then secret drinking, then hidden bottles and elaborate lies about where he'd been and what he'd been doing during unaccounted for time. I'd found the first hidden bottle 6 months after we got married, during spring cleaning in our garage. Vodka tucked behind paint cans and forgotten Christmas decorations, positioned in a way that suggested deliberate concealment rather than casual storage. When I confronted him about it, he claimed it was left over from a housewarming party we'd hosted months earlier. He seemed genuinely confused by my concern and asked why I was making such a big deal about an old bottle of alcohol that had obviously been forgotten during routine cleanup. I wanted desperately to believe his explanation, so I did. The alternative, that my new husband was developing a drinking problem during the first year of our marriage, was too frightening and embarrassing to accept so early in what was supposed to be our honeymoon period. The second hidden bottle appeared in his toolbox 3 months later, discovered when I was looking for a screwdriver to hang pictures in our living room. This time, his explanation was that a coworker had asked him to hold it because the guy's wife was monitoring his drinking and he needed somewhere safe to store alcohol away from home. The story made no sense when I pressed for details. Why would someone ask a married coworker to hide alcohol instead of simply keeping it at the office? And why would my husband agree to participate in helping someone deceive their spouse about drinking? But he got so defensive and angry when I questioned the logic of his explanation that I dropped the subject rather than escalate the conflict. By the time I discovered the systematic pattern of hidden alcohol throughout our house, garage, and vehicles, he'd stopped bothering to manufacture plausible explanations. He'd just get immediately angry when confronted, turning every conversation about his drinking into an attack on my character, trustworthiness, or right to question his personal choices. "You're being paranoid and controlling," he'd say. "You're trying to micromanage my life like I'm a child. You're making problems where none exist just because you need drama to feel important. Maybe if you were more fun to be around and less judgmental about everything, I wouldn't need to drink just to relax when I get home from work." The gaslighting was subtle but devastatingly effective. He had a particular talent for making me question my own perceptions, memories, and emotional reactions to his behavior. When I'd find concrete evidence of his drinking, empty bottles, credit card charges at liquor stores, alcohol on his breath when he claimed he'd been at work or running errands, he'd claim I was being dramatic, paranoid, or imagining things that weren't really problems. When I'd point out inconsistencies in his stories about where he'd been or what he'd been doing, he'd accuse me of being suspicious and untrusting, of looking for reasons to start arguments instead of supporting him through the normal stresses of married life and career development. The gambling addiction started around the same time as the drinking escalated, though I didn't discover the extent of it until much later, when the financial consequences became too large to hide completely. It began innocuously with fantasy football leagues at his workplace that involved small monetary stakes, the kind of thing that seems harmless and social rather than compulsive or problematic. Then came sports betting apps on his phone that he claimed were just for entertainment, nothing serious or financially significant. He'd show me small wins occasionally, highlighting the times when his predictions were correct, and he'd earned $20 or $50, while never mentioning the much more frequent losses that were gradually draining our joint accounts. He'd disappear for hours on weekends, claiming he was running routine errands or meeting friends for casual social activities. I later learned through his brother's wife that these mysterious absences were trips to the local casino, though at the time he presented these outings as normal male bonding activities rather than gambling sessions. The financial red flags started appearing about a year after we were married, subtle at first, but gradually becoming more obvious and harder to explain away. Money would disappear from our joint checking account, with vague explanations that didn't quite add up when I tried to reconcile our budget and understand where our income was actually going each month. Credit card charges would appear at businesses I didn't recognize until I researched the addresses online and realized they were all gambling-related: sports betting services, online poker sites, casino restaurants, and hotels in cities where we hadn't taken trips together. When I asked about these mysterious charges, he'd become immediately defensive and angry, accusing me of spying on him and demonstrating that I didn't trust him to manage his own financial responsibilities. He'd claim the charges were for work-related expenses that would be reimbursed by his company, or surprise gifts for me that he wanted to keep secret until special occasions, or any number of explanations that seemed plausible enough in the moment to prevent me from investigating further. The emotional abuse escalated gradually alongside the addiction issues, so slowly that I didn't recognize the systematic nature of what was happening until I was already deeply damaged by years of accumulated psychological manipulation and verbal assault. It started with small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions or expressions of loving concern for my well-being and success. Comments about my cooking not being quite as flavorful as his mother's family recipes, gentle suggestions that I might want to update my wardrobe or try a new hairstyle to look more professional, casual observations about my work performance or social skills that implied I could be doing better with just a little more effort. Each individual comment seemed minor and potentially even well-intentioned when considered in isolation, but the cumulative effect over months and years was devastating to my self-esteem, confidence, and basic sense of competence as an adult human being. I began second-guessing every decision I made, wondering if I really was as incompetent, unattractive, and socially awkward as his constant stream of observations implied. I started asking for his opinion on everything from what to wear to work to how to handle routine interactions with neighbors, colleagues, and service providers. He had a particular genius for making me feel personally responsible for every problem in our marriage while simultaneously positioning himself as the long-suffering victim of my inadequacies and unreasonable expectations. If he drank too much, it was because I was stressing him out with my constant nagging, criticism, and demands for accountability regarding his behavior and whereabouts. If he gambled away money we needed for household expenses, it was because I wasn't supportive enough of his need to have fun and relax with his friends after working hard to provide for our family. If he was cruel, dismissive, or verbally abusive during arguments, it was because I was being too sensitive, demanding unrealistic levels of attention and affection, or failing to understand the pressures he was under at work and in his relationships with his demanding family members. According to his version of our relationship dynamics, I was the source of all our problems, and his drinking, gambling, and abusive behavior were merely understandable reactions to my failures as a wife and partner. The physical intimacy issues were more complicated and painful than either of us had admitted to anyone, including ourselves and the few friends who were close enough to notice that something seemed wrong with our marriage. He blamed me consistently for not being interested enough in sex, for not initiating physical contact often enough, for not being adventurous or enthusiastic enough during our increasingly rare intimate encounters. But the truth was that I'd gradually lost all interest in being physically intimate with someone who treated me like an enemy and competitor most of the time. It's extraordinarily difficult to feel romantic or sexual towards someone who calls you names, lies to you constantly about important matters, and systematically undermines your confidence and self-worth through daily interactions. His escalating alcohol consumption was also significantly affecting his sexual performance and interest, though he was completely unwilling to acknowledge this connection. Alcohol-induced erectile dysfunction became a regular problem that he blamed entirely on my supposed lack of attractiveness and enthusiasm rather than addressing his own substance abuse issues. When I would occasionally attempt to initiate intimacy during periods when he seemed sober and in a relatively good mood, he'd often be too tired, stressed about work, or distracted by sports television or his phone to participate meaningfully in physical connection. But then he'd complain bitterly to his friends, family members, and apparently his mother about how I was withholding sex and making him feel rejected and unwanted in his own marriage. The therapy suggestion came from my sister Lisa, who had been watching me become increasingly miserable, isolated, and anxious over the months of our marriage. She could see that I was losing weight from chronic stress, that I seemed constantly on edge and unhappy whenever we talked, and that I was making excuses for his behavior that didn't quite make sense when examined logically. I'd hoped desperately that having a neutral third party help us communicate more effectively might save our marriage and restore the happiness we'd experienced during our early dating period. I was still completely convinced that if we could just learn to understand each other's perspectives better and develop more effective conflict resolution skills, we could work through our problems and return to being the compatible, loving couple we'd been during our engagement. I researched therapists in our area who specialized in couples counseling and marriage therapy, reading reviews and credentials to find someone who seemed experienced with the kinds of communication problems we were experiencing. Dr. Sarah Martinez had excellent reviews from previous clients and extensive training in addiction and family dynamics, though at the time I didn't fully understand why those qualifications would be relevant to our situation. The first therapy session was actually quite promising and left me feeling hopeful about our prospects for improvement. Dr. Martinez listened carefully to both of us describe our perspectives on our relationship challenges and helped us identify specific communication patterns that weren't working effectively for either of us. She gave us concrete homework assignments designed to improve our listening skills and practice expressing needs and concerns without triggering defensive reactions from each other. She scheduled regular follow-up appointments to track our progress and adjust our therapeutic goals based on how well we were implementing her suggestions. For a brief period after that first session, I felt genuinely optimistic that we were finally addressing our problems constructively, and that our marriage might survive and even thrive once we learned better ways to understand and support each other. The second session was significantly more challenging and revealed aspects of our relationship dynamics that I hadn't fully recognized or acknowledged, even to myself. Dr. Martinez started asking more direct and specific questions about his drinking habits and their impact on our relationship, our financial stability, and my emotional well-being. She inquired about the frequency and quantity of his alcohol consumption, whether it was interfering with his work performance or family responsibilities, and how I felt about his drinking patterns and the way they affected our daily interactions and long-term planning as a couple. He became increasingly defensive and argumentative during this line of questioning, claiming that Dr. Martinez was biased against men and didn't understand the legitimate pressures he was under in his demanding sales career. He insisted that his drinking was completely normal and social, no different from what any other married man might do to unwind after work, and that I was exaggerating the extent of any problems because I wanted to control his behavior and social activities. When Dr. Martinez gently suggested that he might benefit from individual counseling to explore his relationship with alcohol and develop healthier coping strategies for work stress, he became openly hostile and accusatory. He claimed that she was trying to pathologize normal male behavior and social drinking, that she was encouraging me to have unrealistic expectations about marriage and adult relationships, and that couples therapy was supposed to focus on improving our communication rather than attacking his personal lifestyle choices. After that second session, he announced definitively that he wasn't going back to therapy with me. He said Dr. Martinez was clearly trying to turn me against him, and that couples counseling was just an expensive way for me to gang up on him with a professional witness who would validate my complaints and make him feel like the villain in our relationship. I continued attending individual therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez for several months after he quit couples counseling, trying to understand my own role in our relationship problems and learn more effective ways to communicate with someone who seemed determined to misinterpret everything I said as criticism or attack. Dr. Martinez helped me recognize the subtle but systematic patterns of emotional manipulation and verbal abuse that had become so normalized in our daily interactions that I'd stopped noticing how destructive they were to my mental health and self-esteem. She taught me to identify gaslighting tactics, helped me understand how addiction affects family dynamics and relationship communication, and gave me practical tools for setting healthy boundaries in relationships with people who have substance abuse problems. But knowing what was happening intellectually and being able to change the dynamics practically were two completely different challenges. Even with therapeutic insight and professional guidance, I still hoped desperately that our marriage could be saved through my own improved communication skills and better understanding of his needs and pressures. The individual therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez were eye-opening in ways that were both helpful and terrifying. I began to realize that many of the things I'd been accepting as normal relationship challenges were actually forms of psychological abuse that had been gradually eroding my mental health and sense of reality. The constant criticism of my appearance, cooking abilities, housekeeping standards, work performance, and personality traits wasn't loving feedback designed to help me improve and grow as a person. It was systematic undermining of my self-esteem designed to keep me feeling grateful for his attention and terrified of losing him. The lies about his drinking, gambling, and whereabouts weren't just personal struggles he was dealing with privately. They were deliberate deceptions that were putting our financial security, legal safety, and future stability at serious risk, while preventing me from making informed decisions about my own life. The way he'd consistently turn every conversation about his problematic behavior into a detailed discussion of my supposed flaws and shortcomings wasn't poor communication skills or defensiveness. It was a sophisticated manipulation tactic called deflection that prevented us from ever addressing the real problems in our relation. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I couldn't fix someone else's addiction or abusive behavior through my own efforts. No matter how much I improved my communication skills, set clearer boundaries, or became more supportive of his recovery efforts. She explained gently but firmly that lasting change in these dynamics had to come from genuine commitment and sustained effort by the person with the addiction and abusive behavior patterns, not from increasingly sophisticated management strategies by their spouse or partner. The Thanksgiving confrontation was the culmination of months of escalating tension and rapidly deteriorating circumstances that had pushed me far beyond my emotional and physical limits. I'd been working extra hours and taking on additional freelance projects to cover the money he'd been gambling away, which meant I was chronically exhausted and stressed to the point where my health was beginning to suffer noticeably. My sleep patterns were completely disrupted by anxiety about our finances and constant hypervigilance about his moods and behavior. I'd lost weight from stress and irregular eating, and my colleagues had started commenting on how tired and anxious I seemed during work meetings and social interactions. He interpreted my exhaustion and stress as personal rejection and criticism of his lifestyle choices, rather than natural consequences of the impossible situation he'd created through his addictive behaviors and financial deception. Instead of acknowledging his role in creating our financial and emotional problems, he became increasingly resentful of what he perceived as my negative attitude, lack of support for his needs, and unreasonable expectations about accountability and transparency in our marriage. Rather than having honest, direct conversations with me about his feelings, our relationship problems, or his struggles with addiction, he'd been conducting regular phone conversations with his mother, sharing intimate details about our sex life, my weight fluctuations, my work schedule, and every argument or disagreement we'd had. His mother had never particularly liked me from the very beginning of our relationship. She'd made it clear during our engagement period that she thought her son was settling for someone beneath his social and educational level, someone who didn't match her vision of the type of woman who deserved to marry into their family. She'd frequently made pointed comments about how different I was from the type of accomplished, socially connected women she'd expected him to choose, and she'd often treated me like a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent addition to their family structure. During our marriage, she'd been systematically collecting information about our problems and my supposed shortcomings like ammunition, waiting patiently for the right opportunity to use it against me in the most devastating way possible. She saw herself as her son's primary advocate and protector, And in her twisted understanding of family loyalty, I represented the obstacle preventing him from being happy, successful, and properly appreciated for his wonderful qualities and potential. She'd been encouraging and validating his complaints about me, reinforcing his belief that I was the source of all his problems, and helping him build a comprehensive case for why his drinking, gambling, and abusive behavior were justified responses to my inadequacies as a wife and partner. Rather than encouraging him to address his addiction issues or take responsibility for his harmful behavior, she was actively enabling his worst impulses while helping him construct elaborate justifications for treating me badly. That Thanksgiving dinner was her carefully planned declaration of war, her strategic attempt to humiliate me so thoroughly and publicly that I'd either submit completely to her son's demands and her family's expectations, or leave the marriage in shame and defeat while accepting full blame for its failure. What she hadn't anticipated was that I'd reached the point where I had nothing left to lose and was finally ready to fight back with equal intensity and far more devastating information than she possessed about the real dynamics of our relationship. When I revealed the extent of his hidden drinking, gambling debts, and systematically abusive behavior, I wasn't just defending myself against her attack. I was exposing the reality that they'd both been working collaboratively to hide from the rest of the family and their social circle. The shocked reactions around the table told me immediately that none of his relatives had known about the gambling debts, the extent of his drinking problem, or the way he'd been treating me behind closed doors when no witnesses were present to hold him accountable. His brother's wife looked genuinely horrified when I mentioned the $23,000 he'd lost on sports betting, and I could see her mentally calculating what that kind of financial loss would mean for their own family's stability and future planning. His father, who had always been quiet and reserved during family gatherings, looked directly at my husband with an expression of profound disappointment and concern that spoke volumes about how this information was being received by family members who actually cared about his well-being. Even his uncle, who had been nodding along approvingly with mother-in-law's initial attacks on my character and appearance, stopped eating and stared in obvious shock when I revealed the detailed financial and behavioral information that painted a completely different picture of our marriage. The teenagers at the kids' table had stopped snickering and were listening with wide eyes, probably learning more about adult relationship dysfunction, addiction, and abuse than they'd bargained for when they decided to eavesdrop on the grown-up conversation. My own parents looked mortified, both by mother-in-law's unprovoked attack on me and by the devastating revelations about what my marriage had actually been like behind the facade of normalcy I'd been desperately maintaining for their benefit. Dad's hand was still frozen in midair over the cranberry sauce, and Mom was gripping her napkin so tightly her knuckles were white with tension and shock at what was unfolding in front of the entire extended family. When I placed my wedding ring deliberately next to the gravy boat and announced that I was leaving, I felt like I was finally shedding years of accumulated shame, fear, self-doubt, and the exhausting burden of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. The physical weight of maintaining that facade, making excuses for his behavior, accepting responsibility for problems I hadn't created, and protecting his reputation while sacrificing my own well-being, was finally lifted from my shoulders in that moment of complete honesty and public revelation. I drove straight to my sister Lisa's house, shaking with adrenaline and a complex mixture of terror, relief, and righteous anger that I'd never experienced before in my life. I'd just blown up my marriage in front of 23 people, and I had absolutely no idea what would happen next or how I was going to rebuild my life from the wreckage. Lisa took one look at my face when I arrived at her door and immediately opened a bottle of wine without asking any questions about what had happened or why I'd shown up unannounced on Thanksgiving evening, looking like I'd been through a psychological war zone. She'd been worried about me for months, watching me become increasingly thin, anxious, and isolated, but she'd been reluctant to interfere directly in my marriage without clear evidence that intervention was necessary and wanted. I told her everything that had happened at dinner in exhaustive detail, and for the first time in months I felt like someone was truly listening to me without judgment, hidden agendas, or attempts to minimize what I'd experienced, or convince me that I was overreacting to normal relationship challenges. She didn't try to persuade me to give him another chance, or suggest that I should have handled the confrontation differently. She didn't propose that I should attempt to work things out for the sake of the marriage, or because divorce was somehow a personal failure that reflected badly on my character or commitment to relationships. She just listened actively, validated my feelings and perceptions, and helped me process what had just happened without trying to push me toward any particular decision about what to do next. Then she made up the guest bedroom with fresh sheets and told me I could stay as long as I needed while I figured out my next steps, whether that meant attempting reconciliation or moving forward with separation and divorce proceedings. That night, I couldn't sleep despite my complete physical and emotional exhaustion. I kept replaying the events of the evening in my mind, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake that would destroy any possibility of saving our marriage, if I should call him immediately and try to apologize and find some way to reconcile. But then I'd remember the expression on mother-in-law's face when she'd called me frigid in front of the entire family, the way she'd smiled with satisfaction while delivering information designed to humiliate and destroy me, and the way my husband had just sat there staring at his plate, instead of defending me or acknowledging that sharing our private business was wrong. By morning, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back to the marriage we'd had, and I wasn't interested in trying to build a new relationship with someone who had demonstrated such profound disrespect for my privacy, dignity, and emotional well-being. I spent the entire day after Thanksgiving making lists of everything I needed to do to extricate myself from the marriage safely and legally. Call a divorce attorney, find a new place to live, separate our financial accounts, pack my personal belongings, change emergency contacts at work and with medical providers, update insurance beneficiaries and legal documents. The practical aspects of ending a marriage are overwhelming under the best circumstances, but they become exponentially more complicated when you're simultaneously dealing with the emotional trauma of relationship betrayal and the public humiliation of having your private life exposed for family entertainment. Lisa helped me research divorce attorneys who specialized in cases involving addiction and financial abuse, spending hours online reading reviews, comparing credentials, and looking for someone who would understand the complex psychological and legal dynamics of what I'd been dealing with. The following Tuesday, I met with attorney Rebecca Chen, who had excellent professional reviews and extensive experience handling divorces involving gambling addiction, substance abuse, and emotional manipulation. Her office was designed to put distressed clients at ease during what was probably the most difficult and frightening period of their lives. She reviewed all the documentation I'd been gathering over the months, bank statements clearly showing the gambling losses and unexplained cash withdrawals, photographs of hidden alcohol bottles throughout our house and vehicles, text messages where he'd called me names and made threats, detailed records of the emotional abuse patterns we discussed during my individual therapy sessions. Attorney Chen told me I had an exceptionally strong case for fault-based divorce due to the gambling addiction, hidden debts, systematic financial deception, and well-documented emotional abuse that had been occurring throughout our marriage. She explained that the gambling debts and concealed alcohol purchases would likely work significantly in my favor when dividing marital assets, since he'd been deliberately depleting our shared resources without my knowledge or consent for his own personal addictive behaviors. She also warned me that divorces involving addiction and enabling family members often become particularly contentious and emotionally brutal, especially when the addicted spouse has relatives who see the spouse as the primary problem, rather than recognizing the addiction as the central issue destroying the family. Her prediction proved remarkably accurate over the following months. My husband tried every possible strategy to either win me back or punish me for leaving, alternating between desperate reconciliation attempts and vindictive retaliation designed to make me pay for my decision to prioritize my own well-being over his comfort. He'd call at all hours, leaving tearful voicemails promising to quit drinking and gambling immediately, begging for just one more chance to prove that he could change and become the husband I deserved. Then he'd follow up with angry messages blaming me for giving up on our marriage too easily and abandoning him when he needed support most. He showed up at my workplace twice during the first month after I left, causing scenes in the lobby that were professionally embarrassing and potentially damaging to my career and reputation with colleagues and clients. He sent elaborate flower arrangements to my sister's house with notes begging for forgiveness and promising that he'd already started attending AA meetings and gambling addiction support groups, though I later learned he'd attended exactly one meeting of each before deciding they weren't helpful. When reconciliation attempts didn't produce the results he wanted, he switched tactics and began trying to punish me financially and socially for my decision to leave him. He closed our joint credit cards and checking accounts without warning, forcing me to scramble to establish independent banking relationships and secure alternative funding for basic living expenses. He told mutual friends his carefully crafted version of events, painting me as an unreasonable, mentally unstable woman who had abandoned her marriage over minor problems that could have been worked out with patience, understanding, and proper wifely support. According to his narrative, he was the innocent victim of an ungrateful spouse who had refused to honor her marriage vows when things got difficult, someone who had chosen to destroy their family rather than work through temporary challenges like a mature adult. His mother launched her own comprehensive campaign to discredit me within their social circle and religious community. She told anyone who would listen that I'd been mentally unstable and emotionally abusive throughout the marriage, that I'd refused to get appropriate help for my own psychological problems, and that I'd humiliated their entire family with my inappropriate behavior at Thanksgiving dinner. She presented herself as the grieving mother of a wonderful son who had been victimized by a selfish, manipulative woman who had taken advantage of his kindness and generous nature before abandoning him when he needed support most. Some people believed her version of events, especially those who had closer long-term relationships with her family than with me personally. I lost several friendships during this period, relationships with people who decided that maintaining their social connections to his family was more important than understanding my perspective or supporting me through the divorce process. But I also discovered which friends were truly supportive, trustworthy, and capable of seeing through manipulative narratives to recognize the truth about what had been happening in my marriage. These relationships became deeper and more meaningful as a result of the crisis. My college roommate drove 6 hours to help me pack my belongings from our house while he was at work, ensuring that I could retrieve my personal items without risking a confrontation that might become heated or dangerous. My coworkers offered emotional support, flexible scheduling for legal appointments, and professional references that helped me feel confident about my ability to support myself financially as a single woman. The divorce proceedings lasted 8 months, during which the full extent of his financial problems and deceptive behavior became completely clear through legal discovery and subpoenaed records. The gambling debts were actually much higher than I'd initially discovered, over $37,000 spread across multiple credit cards, online betting accounts, personal loans from friends and coworkers, and cash advances he'd taken using fraudulent information. He'd been intercepting mail to hide the extent of the financial damage from me, but once Attorney Chen subpoenaed complete bank records and credit reports, The comprehensive picture of systematic financial deception emerged in devastating detail. He'd also been taking cash advances on credit cards to fund his gambling activities, then using other cards to make minimum payments in an increasingly unsustainable cycle of debt that was rapidly approaching complete financial collapse. The hidden alcohol purchases were also far more extensive than I'd realized during our marriage. He'd been buying alcohol with cash to avoid leaving obvious traces on our joint accounts, often purchasing multiple bottles at a time and storing them throughout our property and in his car and workplace locations, where I wouldn't think to look for evidence of his drinking problem. During depositions, his family's attorney attempted to portray me as vindictive and unreasonable, someone who was deliberately exaggerating his problems to gain advantage in the divorce proceedings and punish him for what were essentially normal marital disagreements that could have been resolved through compromise and patience. But the documentation was too comprehensive and well corroborated to dismiss or explain away. Financial records don't lie, and the pattern of systematic deception and escalating addictive behavior was clearly established through multiple independent sources of evidence. His own behavior during the legal proceedings didn't help his case or support his family's narrative that he was the innocent victim of an unstable spouse. He showed up to one crucial court date obviously hungover, with bloodshot eyes, trembling hands, and the unmistakable smell of alcohol on his breath, despite the early morning scheduling. His attorney had to request an emergency continuance because his client was clearly in no condition to provide coherent testimony or participate meaningfully in legal proceedings that would determine the financial future of both parties. He also violated the temporary restraining order that prevented direct contact with me by sending threatening and abusive text messages when he was drunk and angry about the divorce proceedings. These violations were carefully documented by my attorney and presented as additional evidence of his inability to control his behavior, even when serious legal consequences were clearly at stake. The judge was obviously unimpressed with his excuses, his mother's character witness testimony that focused more on attacking my personality than demonstrating any positive changes in her son's behavior, and his continued drinking and threatening behavior throughout the divorce process. When the final judgment was issued after months of legal wrangling, I was awarded our house and 70% of our remaining marital assets. The judge specifically cited the hidden gambling debts, the systematic financial deception, the emotional abuse documented in therapy records, and his continued drinking and threatening behavior during the divorce proceedings as primary factors in the asset division. The judge also ordered him to pay my attorney's fees and court costs, noting that his deceptive behavior had unnecessarily prolonged and complicated the proceedings, forcing me to spend additional money on legal representation to protect my interests. Mother-in-law was absolutely furious about the outcome and called me repeatedly to blame me for taking advantage of her son's medical conditions and destroying his financial future when he was supposedly trying to recover from addiction. According to her twisted understanding of addiction and recovery, gambling problems and alcoholism were legitimate medical conditions that should have been met with unconditional compassion and financial support rather than legal consequences and asset protection measures. She seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that addiction doesn't excuse abusive behavior, systematic deception, or financial fraud, and that having a disease doesn't relieve someone of responsibility for the damage their actions cause to other people. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I learned through mutual acquaintances that he'd been arrested for drunk driving during afternoon rush hour. His blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit when police pulled him over for weaving dangerously between lanes on a busy highway where his impaired driving could have killed innocent families. This wasn't his first drunk driving offense, as I discovered during the subsequent accusatory phone call from mother-in-law. There had been at least 2 previous arrests during our marriage that he'd managed to keep hidden from me through expensive lawyer intervention and family financial assistance. Mother-in-law called to blame me personally for his arrest, claiming that my decision to divorce him had driven him to drink more heavily and make increasingly dangerous choices that put himself and others at risk. I listened to her entire self-serving tirade without interrupting, then calmly explained that his drinking problem had existed years before I filed for divorce, and that staying married to an abusive alcoholic wouldn't have prevented him from making dangerous decisions or helped him address his addiction issues. I pointed out that his drunk driving could have killed innocent children and families, and that his choices were his own responsibility regardless of his marital status, emotional state, or family support system. Then I hung up and permanently blocked her number on my phone, all social media accounts, and email systems. I also blocked him and most of his extended family members to prevent further harassment, manipulation attempts, and efforts to make me feel responsible for consequences he'd brought on himself. The first year after the divorce was challenging in unexpected ways that I hadn't fully anticipated despite my preparation and therapy. Even though I felt tremendous relief to be free from constant tension, criticism, and verbal abuse, I still had to rebuild my entire social life and relearn how to be comfortable as an independent single woman. Some mutual friends chose sides during the divorce proceedings, and I lost several relationships that I genuinely valued and expected to maintain, regardless of what happened in my marriage. People I'd considered close friends stopped returning my calls, removed me from social media, and excluded me from group activities where I might encounter his family or their supporters. His extended family obviously severed all connections with me completely, which was actually more of a relief than a loss, given their role in enabling his behavior and attacking my character throughout the divorce process. The financial adjustment required significant lifestyle changes initially. Even though I'd received a favorable asset division and kept our house, I was now responsible for all household expenses, maintenance, and mortgage payments on my single income, instead of the dual income we'd shared during marriage. I had to create entirely new budgets, prioritize expenses differently, and make financial decisions independently for the first time in years. The process was sometimes overwhelming, but it was also deeply empowering to have complete control over my money and financial choices without having to account for someone else's secret gambling losses. But I also rediscovered friendships that had been strained or neglected during my marriage when I'd been too embarrassed, exhausted, or isolated to maintain normal social connections. My college friends welcomed me back into their social circle with warmth and understanding that helped rebuild my confidence in my ability to maintain healthy relationships. Coworkers who had maintained polite but distant professional relationships began including me in after-work social activities and weekend gatherings, helping me develop new friendships based on shared interests rather than marital status or family connections. I started attending a weekly support group for people who'd been married to individuals with addiction issues, which met at a community center near my neighborhood. The group was facilitated by a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in addiction recovery and family therapy. Hearing other people's stories helped me understand that my experiences weren't unusual or particularly dramatic compared to what many others had endured in relationships with addicted partners. Some group members had dealt with physical violence, deliberate financial sabotage that destroyed their credit and career prospects, and children who were traumatized by exposure to addicted parents' unpredictable and dangerous behavior. The support group taught me to recognize behavioral patterns that had made me vulnerable to manipulation and abuse, and helped me develop practical strategies for avoiding similar relationship dynamics in the future. I learned about codependency, enabling behaviors, trauma bonding, and other psychological concepts that explained many of the confusing aspects of my marriage that I'd struggled to understand. I continued individual therapy with Dr. Martinez to work through the accumulated damage to my self-esteem, confidence, and basic sense of reality that had resulted from years of systematic gaslighting and emotional abuse. Recovery from psychological abuse takes much longer than most people realize, and the effects are often more subtle and persistent than the obvious trauma from physical violence. Even after the divorce was legally finalized and I was physically safe from his verbal attacks and financial manipulation, I found myself constantly second-guessing my own perceptions, memories, and emotional reactions to normal life situations. There were days when I wondered if I had been overreacting to his behavior throughout our marriage, if I should have tried harder to be supportive during his struggles with addiction, if I was somehow responsible for his problems getting worse after I left him. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that these persistent doubts were a predictable part of healing from psychological abuse, rather than evidence that I'd made mistakes in my assessment of the situation or my decision to prioritize my own safety and well-being. She taught me to distinguish between healthy self-reflection and the kind of self-blame that abuse victims commonly experience as a result of systematic manipulation designed to make them question their own reality and judgment. 2 years after the divorce, I felt like my authentic self again for the first time in years. I'd regained the weight that chronic stress and anxiety had stripped from my body during the worst periods of my marriage. I was sleeping through the night, had consistent energy throughout the day, and was genuinely enjoying activities that had felt like overwhelming burdens when I was constantly stressed and hypervigilant. I'd been promoted at work and was earning more money than I'd ever made in my career. My supervisor specifically commented on how much more confident, focused, and creative I seemed in client meetings and collaborative projects. The chronic anxiety that had affected my professional performance and workplace relationships was completely gone. I'd developed meaningful new friendships through the support group, my neighborhood community association, and professional networking organization. I'd also successfully rekindled old friendships that had suffered during my marriage when I'd been too embarrassed about my circumstances or too exhausted from managing his behavior to maintain normal social connections. Most importantly, I'd rebuilt my ability to trust my own judgment and recognize the difference between normal relationship challenges that can be worked through with effort and communication, and genuinely toxic behavioral patterns that require immediate intervention and boundary setting. When I eventually started dating again, I approached new relationships carefully and deliberately, taking time to really observe potential partners' behavior patterns before becoming emotionally invested or physically intimate. I'd learned to recognize red flags that I'd previously missed or rationalized away: excessive drinking or drug use, financial irresponsibility or deception, disrespectful treatment of service workers or family members, inability to maintain friendships or professional relationships, and unwillingness to take responsibility for their own problems or mistakes. Last Thanksgiving, I hosted dinner at my house for my sister's family and several close friends I'd made through work and my support group. We cooked together, shared stories about what we were grateful for, and had normal conversations about work projects, movies, books, holiday travel plans, and funny stories about our pets and children. No one used personal information as a weapon or entertainment. No one shared intimate details about their relationships to score points or settle grudges. No one attempted to humiliate anyone else for the satisfaction of winning arguments or asserting dominance. It was the most peaceful, genuinely enjoyable Thanksgiving I'd experienced in years, and it reminded me of what healthy relationships actually look like when they're not complicated by addiction, abuse, manipulation, or toxic family dynamics that prioritize loyalty over honesty. My ex-husband remarried about 18 months ago to a woman nearly 15 years younger than him. According to mutual acquaintances who still maintain contact with his family, she appears more tolerant of his drinking and gambling habits than I ever was, possibly because she lacks the life experience to recognize the warning signs or understand the long-term consequences of enabling addictive behavior. Mother-in-law reportedly adores the new wife and frequently posts social media photos of family gatherings where everyone looks happy and functional. She regularly praises her son's new partner for being supportive and understanding during his continued struggles with what she still characterizes as temporary difficulties rather than chronic addiction issues. I genuinely hope he's found happiness and that his new marriage will be healthier and more sustainable than ours was, though I have realistic doubts about whether someone can build a stable, lasting relationship while continuing to struggle with active addictions that they refuse to address through professional treatment. What I know with absolute certainty is that leaving him was the right decision for my own well-being, safety, and future happiness, even though it was one of the most difficult and frightening things I'd ever done in my life. The woman who sat silently at that Thanksgiving table while being verbally attacked and systematically humiliated doesn't exist anymore. In her place is someone who knows her own worth, recognizes the early signs of unhealthy relationship dynamics, and refuses to accept treatment that falls short of basic respect and human dignity. That transformation was worth every difficult moment of the divorce process, every friendship I lost along the way, and every night I spent wondering if I'd made the right choice in prioritizing my own well-being over maintaining my marriage. That horrible Thanksgiving dinner, as humiliating and devastating as it was in the moment, became the catalyst I needed to finally acknowledge that my marriage was beyond repair and that staying would only continue to damage my mental health, financial security, and fundamental sense of self-worth. Sometimes it takes a moment of complete public humiliation and devastating personal betrayal to reveal the true character of the people around you and give you the clarity and courage you need to make necessary changes that you've been avoiding out of fear, guilt, or misplaced loyalty. I'm genuinely grateful now for that terrible evening because it showed me exactly who I was married to, what kind of family system I'd been desperately trying to fit into, and how much inner strength and resilience I actually possessed when I was finally pushed beyond my breaking point. The most powerful response to people who try to destroy your self-esteem and happiness isn't plotting revenge or waiting for them to fail on their own. It's building a genuinely fulfilling life that demonstrates conclusively how wrong they were about your worth, capabilities, and potential for success and contentment. That's the most meaningful gift I could have given myself, the freedom and courage to become the person I was always meant to be, without the constant weight of someone else's problems, addictions, and abusive behavior dragging me down.